So, for those of you who haven't been before, this is the 11th of 18 lectures that I'm giving as a series, and the overarching title of the series is The Mysteries of Reading and Writing. So in my first 6 lectures, I explored reading as an activity, its history, and how the manner in which we read, as well as the material that we read, has changed over time. And we started with notches on bones in prehistory, which of course is a form of reading. I then gave 4 lectures on the novel as a genre, and talked about its bagginess, that of all the literary genre, it's the genre into which you can stuff all manner of things, feelings, ideas, all sorts of things. And I focused on the 4 novels, 4 themes. I tied up each novel with a theme, and that was morality, political history, idealism, and human psychology, to see how the novel can treat those areas. So tonight is the first of 4 lectures that I'll be giving on poetry. And of course, unlike the language of prose, the language of poetry is endlessly flexible. Prose generally has to be grammatically correct, and prose is language laid out in a linear fashion. In our culture, we read from left to right, but it's essentially linear. Whereas, of course, in poetry, all sorts of other connections between words can be created. I mean, the most obvious is an end rhyme. So you get, say, an AA or AB. The way the line ends and rhymes is setting up other kinds of connections. So you have this linear sense of prose in the novel and something much, much more complicated that goes on in poetry. So tonight we embark on an exploration of Gray's famous Elegy written in a country churchyard. And I want to ask 2 seemingly straightforward questions. The first is, to what extent is the elegy about remembering and remembrance? And secondly, why is it such a very great poem? So Thomas Gray, and had we had the projector, you would see a portrait of a rather frail and sensitive-looking Thomas Gray. He was born in Cornhill, London, on December the 26th, 1716. His father, Philip Gray, was a scrivener here in the City of London, so a scrivener being someone who arranged money loans. And his mother, Dorothy Antrobus, was a milliner. She and her sister ran a milliner's shop. Now, Thomas was actually the 5th of 12 children, but he was the only one of the 12 to survive. And so one can't help thinking that ideas of remembrance and how we remember the dead must have been very much part of his childhood experience to some extent. He lived with his mother after his parents had separated. His father was allegedly a rather rough chap, and his mother was able to send him to Eton College to be educated because he had 2 uncles there who were schoolmasters. And Gray was very studious, hard-working, very interested in his schoolwork, not very keen on sport. And while at Eton, he made 2 very important friends. One of them was Horace Walpole, writer, politician, and antiquarian, and the son of the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. And here you would be seeing a rather wonderful Joshua Reynolds portrait of 1756 of Horace Walpole, which is here in the National Portrait Gallery. And the other friend was Richard West, who went on to be a brilliant lawyer. And he was actually the son of another Richard West, who'd been Lord Chancellor of Ireland. So at Eton, Gray established important friends, and although he was from a relatively modest background, he did have these kinds of connections. And in 1734, he went up to Peterhouse, Cambridge, which he didn't enjoy very much. He thought the teaching was pretty ropey, and he spent most of his time, as he had at Eton, reading literature, both classical and modern, and playing his beloved harpsichord. When you came in, you will have heard Scarlatti on the harpsichord. Scarlatti was one of Gray's favourite composers, and at the end of this evening, you'll hear some Vivaldi on harpsichord. Those were his 2 favourite composers. In 1738, Gray blew out on a grand tour of Europe, which was something that young men who had the means were likely to do. And he went to Tuscany, where he fell out with Horace Walpole, who'd gone with him as his companion, and they went their separate ways. They were reconciled some years later, and it was actually some years later again to Walpole that Gray sent his famous Elegy, and it was Walpole who sent it on to magazines. Gray began writing in earnest in the 1740s. He moved back to Cambridge and embarked on a systematic study of history, politics, and literature. And his contemporaries considered him one of the most learned men of his generation. He became a Fellow of Peterhouse and later of Pembroke Hall, as it was then known, now Pembroke College. Gray is considered to be one of the outstanding poets of the 18th century, but one of the things that's really surprising about this is that he wrote extraordinarily little. All we have is about 1,000 lines of poetry, and his published poetry amounts to 13 pieces and no more. And this is usually explained in terms of Gray's extraordinarily self-critical attitude. And also he had an acute fear of failure, so he only wanted things to get into the public domain that he really felt were ready. In 1768, he was elected Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, but he died 3 years later on the 30th of July 1771 at the age of 55. He was buried beside his mother in the St Giles Churchyard at Stoke's Poges, the setting some commentators claim to have been the inspiration for the famous Elegy. And the poem has gone on being a great inspiration not only to other poets, but also in the visual arts. And so I had wanted you to see Constable's beautiful watercolour of Stoke Poges of 1833. Some very interesting Victorian prints, including one by John Dawson Watson, muttering his wayward fancies would he rove, and also one by a contemporary engraver, Robert Tanner, who did a rather beautiful illustration in 1980. So what I'd like to do now is to play a recording of the Elegy, because of course poems are meant to be heard as well as seen, and this lasts about 8.5 minutes.
The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Save that from yonder ivy-mantled tower the moping owl does to the moon complain, of such as wandering near her secret bower molest her ancient solitary reign. Beneath those rugged elms, that yew tree's shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell for ever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. The breezy call of incense-breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion, or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed. For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy huswife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees, the envied kiss to share. Oft did the harvest to their sickle yield, their furrow oft the stubborn glebe has broke. How jocund did they drive their team afield, how bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Nor you, ye proud, impute to these the fault, if memory o'er their tomb no trophies raise, where through the long-drawn aisle and fretted vault the pealing anthem swells the note of praise. Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion call the fleeting breath? Can honour's voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull, cold ear of death? Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. But knowledge, to their eyes her ample page, rich with the spoils of time, did ne'er unroll. Chill penury repressed their noble rage, and froze the genial current of the soul. Full many a gem of purest ray serene the dark, unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Some village Hampden, that with dauntless breast the little tyrant of his fields withstood, some mute, inglorious Milton here may rest, some Cromwell, guiltless of his country's blood. The applause of listening senates to command, the threats of pain and ruin to despise, to scatter plenty o'er a smiling land, and read their history in a nation's eyes, their lot forbade. Nor circumscribed alone their growing virtues, but their crimes confined, forbade to wade through slaughter to a throne, and shut the gates of mercy on mankind, the struggling pangs of conscious truth to hide, to quench the blushes of ingenuous shame, or heap the shrine of luxury and pride with incense kindled at the muses' flame. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. Yet even these bones from insult to protect, some frail memorial still erected nigh, with uncouth rhymes and shapeless sculpture decked, implores the passing tribute of a sigh. Their name, their years, spelt by the unlettered muse, the place of fame and elegy supply. And many a holy text around she strews, that teach the rustic moralist to die. For who, to dumb forgetfulness a prey, this pleasing, anxious being, ere resigned, left the warm precincts of the cheerful day, nor cast one longing, lingering look behind. On some fond breast the parting soul relies, some pious drops the closing eye requires. Even from the tomb the voice of nature cries, even in our ashes live their wonted fires. For thee, who mindful of the unhonoured dead, dost in these lines their artless tale relate, if chance, by lonely contemplation led, some kindred spirit shall inquire thy fate, haply some hoary-headed swain may say, oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn, brushing with hasty steps the dews away to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. There, at the foot of yonder nodding beech that wreathes its old fantastic roots so high, his listless length at noontide would he stretch, and pore upon the brook that babbles by. Hard by yon wood, now smiling as in scorn, muttering his wayward fancies he would rove, now drooping, woeful wan like one forlorn, or crazed with care, or crossed in hopeless love. One morn I missed him on the customed hill, along the heath and near his favourite tree. Another came, nor yet beside the rill, nor up the lawn, nor at the wood was he. The next, with dirges dew in sad array, slow through the churchway path we saw him borne. Approach and read, for thou canst read the lay graved on the stone beneath yon aged thorn. Here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and to fame unknown. Fair science frowned not on his humble birth, and melancholy marked him for her own. Large was his bounty, and his soul sincere. Heaven did a recompense as largely send. He gave to misery all he had, a tear. He gained from heaven, 'twas all he wished, a friend. No farther seek his merits to disclose, or draw his frailties from their dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God.
So before I go on to a more detailed analysis of the poem, just a few words by way of background. And I think one of the questions we need to bear in mind is, why did Gray choose the elegy form, a very particular kind of poetic form? The term comes from the Greek, which simply means a lament. But in English literature, in the more modern and restricted meaning, it's a lament for a departed one or for a tragic event, and it comes in during the 16th century. And it's a form of poetry that's generally considered to lend itself to contemplation and reflection. And its subject can be various, but it must be treated not in and of itself, not for itself, but always in relation to the poet. And the emphasis is always on absence, either a regret for something that's been lost in the past or a desire for something as yet unfulfilled in the future. So elegy is very much to do with absence. It presents things as lost or past or absent and future. It's a matter of scholarly debate exactly when Gray wrote the elegy, and I think the most convincing theory relates to the way in which we can see the poems that Gray alludes to in the elegy, and therefore those poems must already have been written. And they include Young's Night Thought from the early 1740s, The Grave by Blair, and Hervey's Meditations Among the Tombs of 1746. So I think it's likely that it was written in the late 40s. What we do know is that he sent it to his old friend Horace Walpole on the 12th of June 1750, and it was published that year. Now, I think one of the most exegetically important facts, that's to say facts that relate to how we interpret the poem, and one which many commentators on the elegy don't actually refer, is that there are these two versions. The first is known as the Eaten Manuscript, and it's entitled Stanzas Wrote in a Country Churchyard. It was never published. It passed through the hands of various auction houses and ended up a gift to Eton College, Gray's old school. Now, the first 18 stanzas of the Eaten Manuscript are substantially the same as the published Elegy, but the last 4 stanzas of the Eaten Manuscript, that stanzas wrote in a country churchyard, were rejected by Gray. He put those aside and replaced them with completely new verses. Now, some critics claim that the first version is actually more complete and more balanced than the final Elegy. To describe it briefly, you have 3 introductory stanzas which set the poem and the poet in the graveyard, as in the published version. Then there were 4 balanced stanzas, the first one about the lives of the humble villagers, the second one about the lives of the famous, the third one about the ways in which the humble villagers were prevented from being famous and achieving glory, and then the fourth one, the crimes that are inextricably bound up with success in the world. And the villagers, of course, are immune from this. And the last 3 stanzas of the Eaten Manuscript then balance the first 3. There's a return to the subject of the poet, and in the words of Roger Lonsdale, one of the great Gray critics, this makes clear that the whole poem has been a debate within the poet's mind as he meditates in the darkness. So the Eaten Manuscript, it's really very clear what the elegy is about and how it works as a meditation by the poet. So we don't know why he rejected the first version. I think there are a number of possible explanations. One might be that he felt it was really too private because he was very sensitive to that. I think maybe more convincing is the argument that the actual symmetry and order of this first version suggested a kind of reductiveness that made it all a bit too simple. And Roger Lonsdale, the great critic I've just mentioned, writes, "A simple identification with the innocent but uneducated villagers was mere self-deception." So it may well be that he felt that there was an absence of honesty about the way things were presented in that first manuscript. And then he made these substantial changes, which, as I say, some people argue makes it a less polished poem. I would certainly argue it makes it a much, much more powerful poem, which I hope I'll go on to show. So I think the elegy is complicated by Gray's attempt to integrate his role in society with the social role played by the poet. And in rewriting the poem, some of the straightforward antithetical pairings which were in the original manuscript between rich and poor, between vice and virtue, between life and death, are replaced by a preoccupation with the desire to be remembered after death. And that's a much more difficult idea, to conceive of ourselves being remembered after death. And it's a concern that draws rich and poor together, making the extravagant monuments and the frail memorials that are referenced equally pathetic. This is a departure from the earlier resignation to obscurity and eternal peace and making common cause with the poor in the Eaten Manuscript. Now he contemplates how he may be remembered, or the poet with whom he identifies contemplates how he himself might be remembered. And the assessments he gives in the words of the hoary-headed swain and of the epitaph also evaluate the role of poetry and the poet in society. So there's that crucial point in the poem where the poet needs another presence, that if he's going to consider being remembered himself, someone else has to be present to remember him, and that's the hoary-headed swain, the grey-haired old swain, and the inverted commas that you'll see in the poem make it clear that it's then the swain. The poet is projecting another, the swain, remembering him, the poet. And then, of course, we have the epitaph, which is what's on the gravestone, which is a kind of third voice almost, speaking about the subject after his death. So the published poem ends with an assertion that whilst there's an inseparable connection between poetry and liberty in society, there are forces hostile to poetry. The venture is isolated and is ultimately doomed. Despite this, the poem was, of course, enormously successful. The Monthly Review in 1751 simply commented, and I quote, "This excellent little piece is so much read and so much admired by everybody that to say more of it would be superfluous." And by 1763, there had already been 12 editions. So now I'd like to move on to a more detailed analysis of the poem. And here I'd like to acknowledge a debt to an excellent article by W. Hutchins entitled Syntax of Death, Instability in Gray's Elegy. My conclusions differ from his, but I'd like to acknowledge that article all the same, and also Roger Lonsdale's fantastic edition. On each page of Lonsdale's edition, you might get 2 lines of the elegy, and then the entire rest of the page is notes in rather small type. So, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The knell, of course, is the sound of a bell, especially when rung at a funeral. And here we have 4 words which actually reinforce each other rather than qualifying each other. The tolling of a bell, by the way, had by Gray's time become associated with the parting bell, as it was known, the bell that sounded at a funeral. In Shakespeare, Henry IV, Part 2, there's a bell tolling a departed friend. So, isn't there a degree of superfluity in this line? Wouldn't the curfew tolls the knell of day actually be sufficient? Or even the curfew tolls for parting day? Or even the curfew tolls the day? Or simply the curfew tolls? How much is actually added in this line? There's this extraordinary sort of, superfluity. There's a sort of sense of language that's really unnecessary. And there are other peculiarities about this first line. The verb toll, for example, can be read as both a transitive and an intransitive verb. So George Watson notes, and I add, that verbs in the elegy have the, and I quote, odd property of facing both ways. Or as Hutchins remarks, the curfew tolls something, and yet what it tolls is in effect itself. So it's a very curious use of the verb tolls. So in addition to these sort of superfluities, there are other ambiguities here. The ploughman home plods his weary way. Here we have what's known in the language of rhetoric as a transferred epithet. The epithet weary really applies to the ploughman and not the way that he's plodding. In other words, in conventional syntax, in conventional word order, we'd have the weary ploughman plods his way homeward. So here, the weary has been shifted, as you can do in poetry, and it becomes much more problematic in prose. In other words, it's highly flexible. And so too is the line order, in this first stanza. For instance, why not have 2 rhyming couplets? In that first stanza, we have terminal rhymes of A, B, A, B, but why not have A, B, B? What happens to the meaning? Well, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the ploughman homeward plods his weary way, first couplet. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea, a lea was an open area of grassy land, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Seems to work quite well. But the ABAB rhyme scheme, which is what Gray went for, gives a great sense of grandeur and also a sense of complication. It's also been pointed out that you could exchange the first and the third lines of this stanza, and it could read, the ploughman homeward plods his weary way, the lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now, the syntax of each line is grammatically correct with subject and verb, even if the word order, as we've seen, is very loose. But structurally, the syntax of the stanza as a whole allows each of the first 3 lines to act as a cause reliant on the verb leaves. So each line could be the subject of the main verb leaves. In other words, the tolling bell leaves the world to darkness and to me, the lowing herd, ditto, and the ploughman. Each leaves the world to darkness and to me. And there are 2 datives here, to darkness and to me, and this creates something which, again, in the language of rhetoric would be called a synlepsis, which comes from the Greek taking together. So they're brought into a relationship, the darkness and the poet suggesting his melancholy and the presence of death in the graveyard as he contemplates his own death as a mortal creature. The world of light and life is receding, and as Hutchins notes, quote, Gray's syntax intensifies the isolation of the elegist before complete blankness. The darkness is both immediately physical and a warning image of the final darkness of death. the poem's central preoccupation. Now, some might argue that a herd is a singular noun, therefore requiring the singular form wines, rather than the plural form wined. Gray was a very knowledgeable classicist, and in Latin, more than one nominative can actually take a singular verb. And Milton, who influenced Gray very much, and who was also a very accomplished classicist, he copies this in these lines from the Lycidas, which Gray will have known. Bitter constraint and sad occasion, dear, compels me to disturb your season due. Well, if you've got bitter constraint and sad occasion, you would expect those two to require a plural verb. But in this case, as in Latin, Milton opts for the singular compels rather than compel. Now, in the first version of the poem, Gray had winds slowly rather than wind slowly. Now, it may be that that double S is infelicitous, winds slowly. On the other hand, it could be that wine slowly sounds to the ear like winds lowly, picking up on the lowly bed, which we have in line 20. I think the same thing might be said about the phonetic relationships between tolls and knell, which might allow the ear to hear knoll, tolls, knoll, knoll being a hillock, which adds to the scenery of the lea, the glebe, a field, woods, and so on in lines 26, 27, and 28. But the most famously ambiguous lines are these. Now fades the glimmering landscape of the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds. It's unclear whether the abstract noun should hold or be held by something insubstantial. The air holds a solemn stillness, or a solemn stillness holds the air. Again, if these were lines in Latin, because Latin's an inflected language, the word endings tell you what their grammatical status is, we would know what the subject and the object was. But one of the great things about English not being an inflected language, or at least mostly not, it allows an extraordinary ambiguity and interchangeability and fluidity, which characterizes the language of the poem as a whole. And the last line of the quatrain is uncertain in a different way. And drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Metonymy, in the language of rhetoric, substitutes, in this case, one noun for another. In other words, fold could be a metonym for the sheep that are enclosed. So when you refer to the folds, you mean the folds of sheep. Now, it'd be odd for the enclosures themselves to be lulled. So this creates a kind of circularity of ideas, as the tinklings are presumably the sheep's bells. So the tinklings which lull the sheep are created by the sheep. And drowsy can also be read as a transferred epithet, similar to the weary of the weary ploughman in the first stanza. Drowsy can be read to mean either sleepy or soporific, i.e. sleep-inducing. Tinklings could be soporific, or the sheep could be sleepy. Ambiguity follows ambiguity. So just as there's instability of syntax, instability of word order, a certain kind of interchangeability of line order, there's also this use of metonymy, this idea that a noun is actually referring to another noun. So in the famous line, some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood, for example, his country's blood actually refers to those who've been killed. That's another example of metonymy, and there are lots of examples of it in the poem. So we essentially have a whole lot of techniques that create instability. We have ambiguous syntax, peculiar word order, as it were. We have these transferred epithets where one thing is being described and we have mentally, as it were, to move it to where it belongs, so that the weary way, we know it's the weary ploughman, but we have to make that connection. And I think a further complication, which adds to the complexity of the poem, is the way in which it refers to itself. So we have the breezy call of incense-breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed. For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees, the envied kiss to share. Now, the first quatrain is structurally reminiscent of the first. The call, the swallow's twittering, and the cock's clarion, and the horn are all the subjects of the verb rouse. Each of those lines can be taken as introducing the main verb. The lowly bed of the poor has been presaged in the lowing of the first stanza and the possible reading of wind slowly as winds lowly that I mentioned. The blazing hearth of the second quatrain refers us back to the curfew, because etymologically a curfew comes from the French couvre-feu, to extinguish the fire, to cover the fire. And incense, of course, is also combustible, and it's mentioned again in line 72. The blush of line 55 comes back in line 70, and so on. So, what exactly are the effects of all these various ambiguities and complexities that different sorts of techniques create? Well, I'd like to consider syntax first, that's to say word order. Why are there so many instances where subject and object can be swapped, or verbs could be transitive or intransitive? So Hutchins argues that the unstable syntax mirrors the fact that death can be both active and passive. Death comes to take us away, and we passively have to submit to death. And so he argues that these different verb forms mirror that sense in which we both are taken by death and give ourselves to death. He argues a comforting epitaph would imply certainty about the nature of death. Gray even avoids this certainty. He rests his head upon the lap of earth in line 17. And this is the conventional epitaphic hic jacet, the here lies that you see on the gravestone. The head reposes peacefully upon the consoling lap of Mother Earth. But take this line together with the next, and the result's disturbing. Here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and to fame unknown, in lines 117 to 118. The head, which is the subject of the first line, taken in isolation, becomes the object of the two lines rests, being converted from an intransitive to a transitive verb, and youth taking over the role of subject. The verb rests hovers uneasily between transitive and intransitive, so we're uncertain as to the extent of active or passive being implied. And this continues the whole poem's concern with the possibility of action, but now the action is within the realm of death. In death, the subject becomes an object, and it's the poet's recognition of this that leads him to need another to remember him. And in line 97, haply some hoary-headed swain may say, oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn, brushing with hasty step the dews away. So the poet becomes the object of the swain's remembering of him in life and then in death. Slow through the churchway path we saw him borne. So the hoary-headed swain first remembers seeing him kicking his way through the dew and then being carried in his coffin. And it's the swain who invites us to read the epitaph on the poet's grave. So the poem is clearly about our need to be remembered and to remember, and in our remembrances, we in a sense transcend death. The elegy is about the nature of life and death, of mortality and immortality, but it's also about the nature of memory and memorialization. So I'd like to take things even a step further than that and talk about the ways in which remembrance works. Some of it is relatively overt in the poem, the idea of contemplating, will I be remembered when I'm dead? Does it make any difference whether you're rich or poor, and so on. But one of the most striking things about this poem is its extraordinary allusions to other poems, or borrowings from other poets, or to put it another way, intertextual exploitation, that this is a poem that in which you hear echoes for a plethora of other poems. So in that sense, the living poet, Gray, is revivifying, is bringing back to life the dead poets, that in alluding to their poems, the poems of the dead, they come back into circulation. So if we take the first stanza, and this is all thanks to the wonderful edition of Roger Lonsdale, if we just take the first stanza, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, I won't bother reading it, you've got it there. Now, in a letter of August 1756, Gray acknowledged his debt to Dante's Purgatorio, which translates as, from afar he hears the chimes which seem to mourn the dying day. You can hear the echo very clearly. and also of Inferno. And I translate, the day was departing and the brown air taking the animals that are on earth from their toils, and I one alone. Again, very clear echo. In Shakespeare's Tempest, we have the line, to hear the solemn curfew. And again, in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2, a sullen bell remembered tolling a departing friend. Then we've got Warton, Pleasures of Melancholy, 1747, contemporary of Gray's, and I quote, wherever to the curfew's solemn sound, listening thou sitst. Dryden, that tolls the knell for their departed sense. That's in the prologue to Troilus and Cressida. And the phrase lowing herd was extremely popular. It crops up in Pope's Odyssey, as from fresh pastures and dewy fields the lowing herds return, and so on. There are allusions to Milton, and I don't think there's any poem which actually draws as much on the body of writing that precedes Gray and that Gray had read. So all literature is, in a sense, rewriting. Lonsdale writes, certain features of the elegy, in particular the churchyard setting, the silent darkness, the graves, the bell and the owl, although found in other writers, are exploited with sensational effect by Hervey, Gray's contemporary. So the elegy belongs in a long line of what are essentially rewritings. The allusions to these other poets are acknowledgements, in a sense. They show a certain respect, but they're also being rewritten so that they say what it is exactly that Gray wants to say. They're being plundered for the sake of the living poet being able to articulate what he has to say. So I think one could argue that the whole elegy is, in a sense, an epitaph. The whole poem is a kind of hit yacket, because in this poem lies all this poetry that comes from the dead poets. So from being a doomed project, you could say that poetry ensures its own survival in the way that poets always draw on the dead poets. But even without readers, you could say that the words and therefore the thoughts of great poets live on. They live in our everyday language, even if they become cliches that we fail to attend to, hieroglyphs rather than the vivid language that they are when they're first heard. So how has Gray been left in our language? Well, most famously, Far from the Madding Crowd. Comes to us, of course, from Thomas Hardy, who made his name with that novel. And we quote that line, not necessarily knowing that it was from Gray. You hear a lot of people quoting it. It's very much just part of our language now. And perhaps only guessing as to what madding actually means. It means frenzied, of course. Well, what else has he bequeathed? Well, Paths of Glory. That is an interesting... again, it's become so cliched, but why path? Why paths of glory? Celestial fire. Why celestial fire? Kindred spirit. We wouldn't talk about kindred spirits if it weren't for Gray's elegy. So all these intriguing linguistic utterances come from the elegy, but they live on in everyday language. So rather than ending on what might be an optimistic note, I'd like to open up one further area that we might consider, and that's about the relationship between our abilities seemingly effortlessly to use syntax. In other words, we use words in the correct order. We don't jumble them up. And even more extraordinary, if you suffer from dementia, for example, or even just normal natural human memory loss, as we age, we become forgetful. But what neurologists have recently demonstrated is that we don't forget word order. So you don't hear people saying things like, what did I think was a... breakfast I soon would for like cornflakes. I would soon like my breakfast, or soon I would like cornflakes for my breakfast. Yeah. So we may forget words. We may suffer amnesia about all sorts of things. But what neurologists have demonstrated is that we go on knowing the order in which words should appear, come, syntax seems to be very hardwired. So the poem is arguably also about memory, how we remember, and frailty. And could it be that one of the things that's so moving about the poem is the way in which the syntax is actually made unstable? Because that is not something that is part of human experience. So what remains stable is our grasp of syntax, and it could be that the syntactical instabilities of Gray's use of language has this profoundly disconcerting effect because syntax does seem to be so hardwired in our brains. Well, that's only speculation, and I leave it to you to decide how convincing the idea is. So, to conclude, I'd like to quote from Leslie Stephen, Virginia Woolf's father. Gray's Elegy, he wrote, includes more familiar phrases than any poem of equal length in the language. Its 32 stanzas burst with celebrated phrases. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, and so on. And Robert Mack, Gray's definitive biographer, has also noticed that a recent edition of the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations draws from 15 stanzas and reproduces 13 of them whole. So 13 stanzas of Gray's Elegy are in the Oxford Dictionary of Quotation. So Gray remembers, as I've argued, the dead poets because of these huge number of allusions to the dead poets. And we remember Gray in our language. He lives on, and so deservedly. Thank you.